Ralph Waldo Emerson was born in Boston in 1803 and died in Concord, which people who know that area know that it's not far at all from Boston, in 1878. He lived his life in New England and was a significant part of Boston elite literary circles. His father was a minister, but after the death of his first wife, when he was in his late 20s, and then two of his brothers, not long after that, he had a crisis of faith that pushed him toward what would become his philosophy. He became kind of pantheistic, believing that God was everywhere, and also he emphasized, as we will see, self-reliance. I'm not going to go too much into his biography, but one point is that in 1858, he went into the Adirondacks with 9 other literary figures at the time, of whom Emerson is today the best known. But the next contender would probably be Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who also went on this trip. And when people heard about this, they got a big kick out of it because there were all these notable literary figures all camped out in the woods, and that was interesting to them. And it was an early example of literary people doing this, of going out into the woods to contemplate nature or seek inspiration. While thoughtful people seeking solitude is not new, even among prophets, you have Jesus spending 40 days in the wilderness. You have Muhammad having spent a bunch of time in a cave on a mountain when he received his first visions, and countless other examples of this. This is a very early example of the connection between literature and camping, and I like that. I like literature, and I like camping, and I like the two of them together, and it's cool to see that Emerson and his friends enjoyed the same. I read 2 sets of essays by Emerson, and before getting into the details of them, I want to give some of my general impressions. Not all authors and thinkers take the same approach in doing their writing and their thinking, and indeed they don't view what they're doing the same way. And so there's some variation in, for example, the degree to which a writer will try to justify what they're saying. They might make a claim and then try to demonstrate that the claim that they're making is true by giving supporting evidence. And at the one end of the spectrum, you would have writers like René Descartes and Sextus Empiricus, who do make claims, and in some cases make claims that are maybe difficult to justify, but they acknowledge how difficult it is to demonstrate anything, and so they try to be exhaustive in their demonstrations. And then maybe you have somebody like Edmund Burke, who might be a little more typical for the 18th century. Of course, Emerson is in the 19th century. But Burke is making claims not about knowledge, but about secondary topics, about art, as we've looked at, for example, about the sublime and the beautiful. And he will make a claim and then try to justify it. And to enjoy Emerson, you have to accept that that's not really what he's doing. He's not making a very limited claim and then trying to present an overwhelming argument for that claim. He's writing his thoughts about these topics, and they're fairly well thought out, but they're not a traditional treatise on what he's describing on the topics of his essays. And he kept a journal throughout his life, starting from about the age 16 until he almost couldn't write anymore in his 70s, and his journal apparently includes approximately 4 million words, and I think it's printed in 16 volumes. And some people think his journal is the most important thing that he wrote. But people who are familiar with his journal and familiar with his essays point out that a lot of the topics for his essays come from material that he first wrote about in his journal. And that, of course, makes sense if you keep a journal or a notebook, just a place where you jot down your thoughts. It doesn't have to be at night before you go to bed, but just throughout the day, if you think of something, you jot it down. And maybe you develop your ideas there a little bit. It's natural that your writing would reflect some of that. Now, the problem is that if you wanted to be hostile in reading Emerson, if you wanted to go in and try to find the sentences that are most vulnerable to criticism, you could do that without trying very hard. Not because what he's saying doesn't make sense, but he sometimes writes in a way where he sort of assumes that you know what he's talking about. And he'll make a giant claim about history or about the universe or about man or something like that. And he's apparently not thinking about these claims as a flag that he's planted and is now defending against attackers. He's just rhapsodizing about his view of the universe, which is fine. And I think there's still a lot to get out of Emerson. But it's a different kind of writing. A word that Emerson is often associated with is transcendentalism. And that is a concept of which it is easier to show examples than it is to define. So I think we can get into it now. These passages are taken from a number of his essays, including History, Self-Reliance, that's probably his most famous one, The American Scholar, Heroism, and a number of others. Emerson writes, quote, "The creation of 1,000 forests is in one acorn, and Egypt, Greece, Rome, Gaul, Britain, America lie folded already in the first man. Epoch after epoch, camp, kingdom, empire, republic, democracy are merely the application of his manifold spirit to the manifold world. Of the universal mind, each individual man is one more incarnation. All its properties consist in him," end quote. And then skipping ahead a little bit, quote, "I have no expectation that any man will read history aright who thinks that what was done in a remote age by men whose names have resounded far has any deeper sense than what he is doing today. There is no age or state of society or mode of action in history to which there is not somewhat corresponding in his life," end quote. One thing to note, because it comes up, is that somewhat is often used here to mean something like something. So in a sense, what he's saying here is true, right? That in a certain way, the forest exists in the acorn, and in a certain way, the state exists in the man. And this is an example of the part and its relation to the whole. I'm thinking of another example somebody gave somewhere about whoever understands one drop of water and contemplates it could imagine an ocean or a waterfall. And this thought, like many of those that we're going to look at today, is more poetic than analytic, but there's something true about it. And though the excerpts that we're going to be looking at today are all taken from essays, Emerson did write a lot of poetry, and you can see how that influenced his essay writing. In this next passage, he's encouraging the reader to trust his own instinct and to pay attention to his own thoughts and to give them importance similar to, and maybe more than, the importance that you give to old writers. He writes, quote, "Familiar as the voice of the mind is to teach, the highest merit we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they set at naught books and traditions, and spoke not what men, but what they thought. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. Yet he dismisses without notice his thought, because it is his. In every work of genius we recognize our own neglected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Great works of art have no more affecting lesson for us than this. They teach us to abide by our own spontaneous impression with good-humored inflexibility, than most when the whole cry of voices is on the other side. Else tomorrow a stranger will say with masterly good sense precisely what we have thought and felt all the time, and we shall be forced to take with shame our own opinion from another. There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better, for worse, as his portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given to him to till." End quote. He later says further, quote, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Great men have always done so, and confided themselves, childlike, to the genius of their age, betraying their perception that the absolutely trustworthy was seated at their heart, working through their hands, predominating in all their being. And we are now men, and must accept in the highest mind the same transcendent destiny, and not minors and invalids in a protected corner, not cowards fleeing before revolution, but guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the almighty effort and advancing on chaos and the dark." End quote. On this podcast, we've also talked about John Stuart Mill, who was writing in the 19th century, and he wrote a lot about the individual and society and the relationship between the two. And Emerson didn't write as directly as Mill did on that topic, but he definitely touches on it. And for many of the same reasons during the 19th century, as we saw in that episode, the urban population of the world exploded for a number of reasons, and this affected how people thought about things a lot. Emerson writes, quote, "Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree, for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder, to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. It loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world." End quote. As I've gotten older, it's become more plain to me that all people are not equal, and for that reason it would be inappropriate to give all people the same advice and to recommend the same habits and behaviors. This principle that Emerson is talking about here is very important because at some level it's, as he's saying, the jumping off point for a lot of creative thought. If you can only trust and put importance in what you read from the past, then there's no way to create new knowledge or to create new perspectives or to make new discoveries. So you have to also put importance on your own thoughts, on your own observations, on what occurs to your mind, on what appears to be true to you, even if that is out of sync with the customs of the time and place in which you're living. Now, the problem is that, as I said, not all people are the same, and there are at least two types in considering this principle. One type is the overly cautious, who is very disinclined to trust their own thoughts and is more likely to defer to someone else about what they should think. And this type of person is often very thoughtful and careful. And then there's another type who is so careless in their thinking that they barely even know what it is that they think. And when I think of Emerson's advice here, I'm thinking of all the different people who could encounter it. And if you were telling the first type, then you'd probably be doing something productive for society. Not that that person should never learn what people of the past have thought about certain topics, but maybe they should give themselves a little more credit in their own thinking and follow those thoughts a little bit. Spend time not only reading, but contemplating and writing down your own thoughts and trying to develop them. It's also clear why Emerson was thinking about this, because he spent a lot of time doing this, wrestling with his own thoughts and comparing them to those of people that he read, and he maybe found himself relying too much on other people's thoughts and didn't want to do that. Now, the problem is if you encourage the second type of person to do this, the person who is overly confident in what they think and they barely even know what they think, but they trust the first thought that comes to their head completely, it seems that it might not be productive to give that person this level of confidence in their own thought. And that person would benefit more, not by just thinking and acting accordingly, but by learning about the thoughts that other people have had about various topics. Now, the filter that might exist here is that the likelihood that the second type of person would spend any time reading a writer like Emerson, or maybe any writer for that matter, is close to zero. So the only people who are going to encounter this thought, or thoughts like it, are going to be closer to the first type. He later expands on this. Quote, "No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names, very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution. The only wrong is what is against it. A man is to carry himself in the presence of all opposition, as if everything were titular and ephemeral but he. I'm ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions. Every decent and well-spoken individual affects and sways me more than is right. I ought to go upright and vital, and speak the rude truth in all ways." End quote. I doubt that Emerson meant it this way, but there is, in that passage, a flash of a Nietzschean transcendence of morality. Emerson said, "The only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong what is against it." That sounds a bit like some of what Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, and these guys were also writing at similar times, though Emerson was earlier than Nietzsche, and also on a different continent. And also, I don't think that Emerson meant this in the harsh and bold and ferociously individualistic way that Nietzsche meant it. I think that Emerson was just encouraging us to re-examine what people say is good and bad, and to not take for granted that some customary definition or some definition that someone else has given you is reliable. In this next passage, Emerson is talking about giving to charity and to whom he will and won't give and for whom he will and won't sacrifice, and also what is really being done when we give to charity, what we're actually doing, and what we might better do instead. And it's worth it to know in this passage that expiation is another word for atonement, and to expiate is to atone. Emerson writes, quote, "There is a class of persons to whom by all spiritual affinity I am bought and sold. For them I will go to prison if need be. But your miscellaneous popular charities, the education at college of fools, the building of meeting houses to the vain end to which many now stand, alms to sots, and the thousandfold relief societies, though I confess with shame I sometimes succumb and give the dollar, it is a wicked dollar, which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold. Virtues are, in the popular estimate, rather the exception than the rule. There is the man and his virtues. Men do what is called a good action, as some piece of courage or charity, much as they would pay a fine in expiation of daily non-appearance on parade. Their works are done as an apology or extenuation of their living in the world, as invalids and the insane pay a high board. Their virtues are penances. I do not wish to expiate, but to live. My life is for itself, and not for a spectacle. I much prefer that it should be of a lower strain, so it be genuine and equal, than that it should be glittering and unsteady." End quote. This next passage makes me think of the word renewal. And he doesn't say renewal, but he talks about holding on to old behaviors, old things that you've done. And one of the things that he says that does is it detracts from what you could be doing instead. That if you just have a habit of voting for a certain party or doing a certain thing, then that's taking away from what you could be doing and what maybe you are even doing now, but you're spending less time on it because you're still holding on to these other things that maybe don't make as much sense to you as they used to, or they don't reflect your view of the world as much as they used to. He writes, quote, "What I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. This rule, equally arduous in actual and in intellectual life, may serve for the whole distinction between greatness and meanness. It is the harder because you will always find those who think they know what is your duty better than you know it. It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is who, in the midst of the crowd, keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. The objection to conforming to usages that have become dead to you is that it scatters your force. It loses your time and blurs the impression of your character. If you maintain a dead church, contribute to a dead Bible society, vote with a great party, either for the government or against it, spread your table like base housekeepers, under all these screens I have difficulty to detect the precise man you are. And of course, so much force is withdrawn from your proper life. But do your work, and I shall know you. Do your work, and you shall reinforce yourself." End quote. He later writes, quote, "Most men have bound their eyes with one or another handkerchief and attached themselves to some one of these communities of opinion." End quote. In this next passage, he talks about another disadvantage, another payment that you have to make in adhering to a particular community of opinion, as he describes it. He talks about how you have to put on a dumb face. Physically, you have to have a certain kind of expression on your face in order to sit through certain boring and uncomfortable conversations with people you don't agree with. He writes, quote, "Nature is not slow to equip us in the prison uniform of the party to which we adhere. We come to wear one cut of face and figure, and acquire by degrees the gentlest asinine expression. There is a mortifying experience in particular which does not fail to wreak itself also in the general history. I mean, the foolish face of praise, the forced smile which we put on in company where we do not feel at ease in answer to conversation which does not interest us. The muscles, not spontaneously moved, but moved by a low usurping willfulness, grow tight about the outline of the face with the most disagreeable sensation." End quote. In this next passage, he's gotten into what might happen if you try to be more self-reliant, if you try to trust your own judgment and trust your own views and disagree when things don't make sense to you and to ask questions until they do make sense. You will earn the rage of the cultivated classes, as he puts it, which is maybe not such a big deal. But then something else will happen too, which can be harder to deal with. He writes, quote, "It is easy enough for a firm man who knows the world to brook the rage of the cultivated classes. Their rage is decorous and prudent, for they are timid, as being very vulnerable themselves. But when to their feminine rage the indignation of the people is added, when the ignorant and the poor are aroused, when the unintelligent brute force that lies at the bottom of society is made to growl and mow, it needs the habit of magnanimity and religion to treat it godlike as a trifle of no concernment. End quote. Emerson is an author who does get quoted a fair amount, but this next one, it's brief, but it might be among the most quoted passages of Emerson, and it's often slightly misquoted, so it's worth it to hear it in its original form. And that is, quote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines." End quote. He writes that line in prose, and this is an example in particular of how the line between poetry and essay is not clearly demarcated in Emerson's writing, because if you notice, that line rhymes. And I've puzzled over this line because I think consistency is extremely important. You have to be consistent, most of all, in scrutinizing the various ideas and information that you encounter in the world. And I think that the reason why people have the views that they have almost always is because of a selective scrutiny. They're not consistent in scrutinizing everything equally. They scrutinize one thing very closely or in a way that someone else told them to scrutinize it, and then they don't scrutinize their own views. So consistency is very important, but Emerson wrote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." So I guess he's talking about a consistency when it wouldn't be appropriate, or when you are comparing two things that are not comparable. In this next passage, Emerson refers to that popular fable. So he must be talking about something that was relatively well known at the time, but I'd never heard this before. But it seems like something that certainly happened at least once in history, and probably more than that. I'll read the passage first, then we'll talk about it a bit. Emerson writes, quote, "That popular fable of the sot who was picked up dead drunk in the street, carried to the Duke's house, washed and dressed and laid in the Duke's bed, and on his waking, treated with all obsequious ceremony like the Duke, and assured that he had been insane, owes its popularity to the fact that it symbolizes so well the state of man, who is in the world a sort of sot, but now and then wakes up, exercises his reason, and finds himself a true prince." End quote. Now, the problem is that in comparing that story to a day when we wake up and are exercising our reason to the best of our ability and discover some important thought, if we have in that moment become elevated somehow by using our reason well, if we compare it to the story, which is about a drunk who is being tricked into thinking he's a prince, then even in that time when we're using our reason, we are really just mistaken. And while there are certain thinkers who I think would agree with that even when we think we are thinking about something important, we really just are deceived in one way or another, that doesn't really feel like what Emerson has been talking about in his essays. He doesn't spend a lot of time trying to make a really hard skeptic argument. In this next passage, he compares man to the rest of nature, and then to children in a schoolroom, and says that we spend all this time learning about what other people say, but when we get into the frame of mind of those people who said those things, then we don't need to know what they say because we just understand it and we can say it intuitively. And he's saying this in part to say that we don't need to spend so much time studying other people, that we should trust our own judgment. This is a recurring theme in his writing, particularly in the essay called Self-Reliance. But the trouble is that studying the writing of certain thinkers helps us to understand how they thought, and to try to understand how they thought without reading their writing would be very difficult or impossible. So he says when we come into their point of view, we don't need to think about their writing anymore, but the best way to access that point of view is through their writing. On this podcast, what we're doing is looking at writers from the past, and Emerson is often saying that we don't need to do that, though I'm sure he spent a lot of time doing that because he quotes a lot of old writers. And I sometimes get the sense that what he was doing was working himself up so that he could just write his own thoughts instead of quoting other people. Because when you're sitting and writing an essay, there is a strong pull to write what somebody else thought instead of writing what you thought, because you don't necessarily think that that's valuable enough. So I do think that Emerson would think that what we're doing here is valuable. Though ironically, that doesn't matter, because then we get stuck in this loop where we're then thinking that what we are today doing is valuable because some writer from the past who thinks that you don't need to pay too much attention to writers from the past, thinks is valuable. So we don't need to ask anybody's permission. If we think this is valuable, we can do it. And I think it's valuable. Anyway, here's that passage. Quote, "Man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright. He dares not say, I think, I am, but quotes some saint or sage. He is ashamed before the blade of grass or the blowing rose. These roses under my window make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are for what they are. They exist with God today. There is simply the rose. It is perfect in every moment of its existence. Before a leaf bud has burst, its whole life acts. In the full-blown flower there is no more. In the leafless root there is no less. Its nature is satisfied, and it satisfies nature in all moments alike. But man postpones or remembers. He does not live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or, heedless of the riches that surround him, stands on tiptoe to foresee the future. He cannot be happy and strong until he too lives with nature in the present above time. This should be plain enough. Yet see what strong intellects dare not yet hear God himself unless he speak the phraseology of I know not what David or Jeremiah or Paul. We shall not always set so great a price on a few texts, on a few lives. We are like children who repeat by rote the sentences of grandams and tutors, and as they grow older of the men of talents and character they chance to see, painfully recollecting the exact words they spoke. Afterwards, when they come into the point of view which those had who uttered these sayings, they understand them and are willing to let the words go, for at any time they can use words as good when the occasion comes." End quote. In a short passage about truth, he writes, quote, "If we cannot at once rise to the sanctities of obedience and faith, let us at least resist our temptations. Let us enter into the state of war and wake Thor and Woden, courage and constancy, in our Saxon breasts. This is to be done in our smooth times by speaking the truth. Check this lying hospitality and lying affection." End quote. This next passage is a bit longer. Here, Emerson talks about courage and our tolerance for failure and how different types of people deal with failure. I have read and encountered that American culture is more tolerant of failure than some other cultures. That, for example, Americans are more likely to start a business because the social cost of the business failing is not as high as it is in some other countries. That if you try a business and it doesn't work out, people don't think that much less of you. But in other countries, if you do that, people are more likely to talk about you behind your back and make fun of you and whatever. And this cannot be attributed only to Emerson. It's possible that he was simply speaking in a voice that was popular at the time. But this view in this next passage reflects that culture of being willing to try and fail and encouraging people to try and fail. He writes, quote, "The sinew and heart of man seem to be drawn out, and we are become timorous, desponding whimperers. We are afraid of truth, afraid of fortune, afraid of death, and afraid of each other. Our age yields no great and perfect persons. We want men and women who shall renovate life and our social state, but we see that most natures are insolvent, cannot satisfy their own wants, have an ambition out of all proportion to their practical force, and do lean and beg day and night continually. Our housekeeping is mendicant, our arts, our occupations, our marriages, our religion we have not chosen, but society has chosen for us. We are parlor soldiers. We shun the rugged battle of fate, where strength is born. If our young men miscarry in their first enterprises, they lose all heart. If the young merchant fails, men say he is ruined. If the finest genius studies at one of our colleges and is not installed in an office within 1 year afterwards in the cities or suburbs of Boston or New York, it seems to his friends and to himself that he is right in being disheartened and in complaining the rest of his life. A sturdy lad from New Hampshire or Vermont, who in turn tries all the professions, who teams it, farms it, peddles, keeps a school, preaches, edits a newspaper, goes to Congress, buys a township, and so forth in successive years, and always like a cat falls on his feet, is worth 100 of these city dolls. He walks abreast with his days and feels no shame in not studying a profession, for he does not postpone his life, but lives already. He has not one chance, but 100 chances. Let a Stoic open the resources of man and tell men they are not leaning willows, but can and must detach themselves. That a man is the Word made flesh, born to shed healing to the nations, that he should be ashamed of our compassion, and that the moment he acts from himself, tossing the laws, the books, idolatries, and customs out of the window, we we pity him no more, but thank and revere him. And that teacher shall restore the life of man to splendor, and make his name dear to all history. It is easy to see that a greater self-reliance must work a revolution in all the offices and relations of men, in their religion, in their education, in their pursuits, their modes of living, their association, in their property, in their speculative views." End quote. In one place he says, briefly, quote, "Discontent is the want of self-reliance. It is the infirmity of will." End quote. In this next passage, he talks about traveling and how traveling is maybe not as important as we think it is. And that remains true today, maybe because traveling is easier today than it was 150 years ago when Emerson was writing. Travel, and particularly international travel, is a status indicator in modern life. But Emerson points out that it need not be, and actually little important work is done in traveling. It's worth it to note in this next passage, he writes traveling with a capital T, sort of like it's a religion. He writes, quote, "It is for want of self-culture that the superstition of traveling, whose idols are Italy, England, Egypt, retains its fascination for all educated Americans. They who made England, Italy, or Greece venerable in the imagination did so by sticking fast where they were, like an axis of the earth. In manly hours, we feel that duty is our place." End quote. So the way that England, Italy, and Greece became great was because the people who were there didn't travel somewhere else and do something. They built up England, Italy, and Greece. They worked on their own communities. And on being yourself, he writes, quote, "Insist on yourself, never imitate. Your own gift you can present every moment with the cumulative force of a whole life's cultivation. But of the adopted talent of another, you have only an extemporaneous half possession." End quote. Another way to think about that is that in imitating somebody else, you can only be an imitation of them. But the only person who can be you is you. And anybody trying to imitate you will only be a shadow of you in the same way. And here's another short one. Quote, "If you would not be known to do anything, never do it. Be and not seem." End quote. And "be and not seem," esse quam videri, is actually taken from a Cicero essay called Friendship. And it's a phrase that means that it's more important to actually sincerely be the thing that you're trying to be, rather than to appear that way. And I always like to see passages that show that even famous writers, famous thinkers, had to deal with the ordinary tasks of everyday life. And here's a passage where Emerson talks about that. He writes, quote, "Time, which shows so vacant, indivisible and divine in its coming, is slit and peddled into trifles and tatters. A door is to be painted, a lock to be repaired. I want wood or oil, or meal or salt. The house smokes, or I have a headache. Then the tax and an affair to be transacted with a man without heart or brains, and the stinging recollection of an injurious or very awkward word. These eat up the hours." End quote. In this next passage, Emerson is talking about householding, about keeping a house. And I just bought my first house last year, so I've been getting into the various things that are involved in that, in small repairs and keeping the garden. We have a vegetable garden in our backyard. We grew some things last summer, and we're getting ready to grow some things this summer too. And so this next passage where he's talking about the various duties involved in keeping a house stood out to me. He writes, quote, "We are instructed by these petty experiences which usurp the hours and years. The hard soil and 4 months of snow make the inhabitant of the northern temperate zone wiser and abler than his fellow who enjoys the fixed smile of the tropics. The islander may ramble all day at will. At night, he may sleep on a mat under the moon, and wherever a wild date tree grows, nature has, without a prayer even, spread a table for his morning meal. The northerner is perforce a householder. He must brew, bake, salt, and preserve his food, and pile wood and coal. But as it happens that not one stroke can labor lay to without some new acquaintance with nature, and as nature is inexhaustibly significant, the inhabitants of these climates have always excelled the southerner in force. Such is the value of these matters that a man who knows other things can never know too much of these." End quote. And skipping ahead a bit, quote, "The domestic man who loves no music so well as his kitchen clock and the airs which the logs sing to him as they burn on the hearth has solaces which others never dream of. The application of means to ends ensures victory, and the songs of victory not less in a farm or a shop than in the tactics of party or of war. The good husband finds method as efficient in the packing of firewood in a shed or in the harvesting of fruits in the cellar as in peninsular campaigns or the files of the Department of State." End quote. So he's saying that keeping your house in order can be done as carefully and thoroughly as maintaining documents at the State Department. And home life and family life is something that's not really emphasized a lot in popular culture. the importance of maintaining your home, not just your house, but your home and your family. And not only for women, but the man's role in his home. These are important things that are worth contemplating and taking care and executing them. And they're not really emphasized in the mainstream. In fact, they're often taken for granted or assumed to be indestructible, that nothing you can do could really harm them, or replaceable, that you could change them out for a modern, untested alternative on which the preliminary research and reports are not great. Later on of man, he says, and it's worth it to know in this passage that a gibbet is a gallows. He says, quote, "Let him hear in season that he is born into the state of war, and that the commonwealth and his own well-being require that he should not go dancing in the weeds of peace, but warned, self-collected, and neither defying nor dreading the thunder, let him take both reputation and life in his hand, and with perfect urbanity dare the gibbet and the mob by the absolute truth of his speech and the rectitude of his behavior. Toward all this evil, the man, within the breast, assumes a warlike attitude and affirms his ability to cope single-handed with the infinite army of enemies. To this military attitude of the soul we give the name of heroism. Its rudest form is the contempt for safety and ease, which makes the attractiveness of war. It is a self-trust which slights the restraints of prudence in the plenitude of its energy and power to repair the harms it may suffer. The hero is a mind of such balance that no disturbances can shake his will, but pleasantly, and as it were merrily, he advances to his own music, alike in frightful alarms and in the tipsy mirth of universal dissoluteness." End quote. He later says, quote, "Self-trust is the essence of heroism. It is the state of the soul at war, and its ultimate objects are the last defiance of falsehood and wrong, and the power to bear all that can be inflicted by evil agents." End quote. In this next passage, he talks a bit more about heroism. These are taken from an essay called Heroism. And he says that one of the defining traits of heroism, of the hero, is not needing luxury, which is certainly true. It's kind of hard to imagine a hero who needs very fine surroundings. But he also points out that that is an effect of the hero perceiving that virtue is sufficient, which is a Stoic principle. Quote, "The heroic soul does not sell its justice and its nobleness. It does not ask to dine nicely and to sleep warm. The essence of greatness is the perception that virtue is enough. Poverty is its ornament. It does not need plenty and can very well abide its loss. But that which takes my fancy most in the heroic class is the good humor and hilarity they exhibit. It is a height to which common duty can very well attain, to suffer and to dare with solemnity. But these rare souls set opinion, success, and life at so cheap a rate that they will not soothe their enemies by petitions or the show of sorrow, but wear their own habitual greatness." End quote. And talking about this good humor and hilarity that he says that heroes exhibit, he gives the example of what he calls Sir Thomas More's playfulness at the scaffold. And Thomas More is, of course, a 16th century English philosopher and statesman who is maybe best known for writing Utopia, but he was, among other things, an opponent of the Reformation. And when he refused to take the oath of supremacy, which was a vow to the monarch of England as the head of the church, he refused to take that oath, and so he was accused of treason and hanged. And reportedly he said to his executioner, quote, "Pray, sir, see me safe up, and as to my coming down, let me shift for myself." End quote. And this is the kind of thing that Emerson says takes his fancy about the heroic class. And it's easy to see why this good-hearted laughing, even in the face of one's imminent death, is certainly part of the essence of what we consider heroic. Emerson puts forward a thought about another such part. He writes, quote, "The characteristic of heroism is its persistency. All men have wandering impulses, fits and starts of generosity. But when you have chosen your part, abide by it, and do not weakly try to reconcile yourself with the world. The heroic cannot be the common, nor the common the heroic." End quote. And in this next part, he references Lovejoy, who is Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, a minister and abolitionist who was murdered by a mob because he was an abolitionist and is viewed as a defender of free speech and of the freedom of the press. Quote, "Human virtue demands her champions and martyrs, and the trial of persecution always proceeds. It is but the other day that the brave Lovejoy gave his breast to the bullets of a mob for the rights of free speech and opinion, and died when it was better not to live. I see not any road of perfect peace which a man can walk, but after the counsel of his own bosom. Let him quit too much association, let him go home much, and establish himself in those courses he approves. The unremitting retention of simple and high sentiments and obscure duties is hardening the character to that temper which will work with honor, if need be in the tumult or on the scaffold. End quote. And skipping ahead, quote, coarse slander, fire, tar and feathers and the gibbet, the youth may freely bring home to his mind, and with what sweetness of temper he can, and inquire how fast he can fix his sense of duty, braving such penalties, whenever it may please the next newspaper and a sufficient number of his neighbors to pronounce his opinions incendiary. End quote. At one point, he says outright that what he's doing is experimenting with his thoughts. He writes, quote, lest I should mislead anyone, I have my own head and obey my whims. Let me remind the reader that I am only an experimenter. Do not set the least value on what I do or the least discredit on what I do not, as if I pretended to settle anything as true or false. I unsettle all things. No facts are to me sacred, none are profane. I simply experiment, an endless seeker with no past at my back. End quote. So he explicitly says that he's not trying to determine anything to be true or false, which at the beginning I said that one thing for which somebody could criticize Emerson is that he sometimes says things that are hard to demonstrate as true. But he says here that anyway, that's not what I'm doing. That's not his game. He's doing something else. He's experimenting. He's unsettling. Talking about fear and superstition, Emerson writes, quote, we boast our emancipation from many superstitions, but if we have broken any idols, it is through a transfer of the idolatry. What have I gained? That I no longer immolate a bull to Jove or to Neptune, or a mouse to Hecate, that I do not tremble before the Eumenides, or the Catholic purgatory, or the Calvinistic judgment day. If I quake at opinion, the public opinion, as we call it, or at the threat of assault, or contumely, or bad neighbors, or poverty, or mutilation, or at the rumor of revolution, or of murder. If I quake, what matters it what I quake at? End quote. I've mentioned before that I'm very interested in the task of trying to build better models for political events and social activity. And when you bring up that topic, people will often get a little defensive because I think they don't like the idea that a human can be predicted in any way. They want to believe that there's something inherently unpredictable about humans, that we are true individual agents of our action. And we are not yet close to being able to predict even large-scale human action with much accuracy because it's too complicated. There are too many factors. There are too many components, too many things bouncing off of each other. But the problem of the power of the individual is another aspect of why it's difficult to predict such events, that individuals and groups of individuals are able to accomplish things that are beyond what you would have otherwise expected of them, because there are other individuals who don't accomplish very much. So the maximum possible impact of an individual or a group is much higher in the long tail distribution. And this next passage from Emerson caught my attention because it comments a little bit on that aspect of humans. Quote, the boundaries of personal influence it is impossible to fix, as persons are organs of moral or supernatural force. Under the dominion of an idea which possesses the minds of multitudes, as civil freedom or the religious sentiment, the powers of persons are no longer subjects of calculation. A nation of men unanimously bent on freedom or conquest can easily confound the arithmetic of statists and achieve extravagant actions out of all proportion to their means, as the Greeks, the Saracens, the Swiss, the Americans, and the French have done. End quote. When talking about Emerson, people will often comment on what he contributed to individualism in American culture. And that's probably fair. A lot of what he writes about has to do with that. He's not really much of a collectivist, but he does sometimes make points that are, if not anti-individualistic, they point out how humans are not all absolutely unique individuals. He writes, quote, we fancy men are individuals, so are pumpkins, but every pumpkin in the field goes through every point of pumpkin history, end quote. I like that because it's useful to think about humans in their biological state. No pumpkin is exactly like any other pumpkin. So in that way, they are distinct, but they all follow a predictable path. They grow on a vine. First, they're smaller, they get bigger. And humans too, though each one is distinct in certain ways, they share a lot of things in common, and it's worth observing that. In these next passages, which are taken from an essay called The American Scholar, he's talking about the role of the scholar, how he does, what he should do. And in this first one, he mentions Flamsteed and Herschel. And John Flamsteed and William Herschel are both astronomers, important astronomers. John Flamsteed is from England, late 17th, early 18th century. And William Herschel is a bit later. He lived in the 18th century. Flamsteed founded the Royal Greenwich Observatory and prepared a very big star catalog. He was hired by the king explicitly for this purpose in order to improve the navigation of British ships. That's King Charles II. And Flamsteed was also the first royal astronomer. His star catalog had 3,000 stars in it, while Herschel's, he had two. One had 2,500 and the other 5,000 objects in it. Herschel also developed an innovative telescope and pioneered the use of what we today call astronomical spectroscopy, which is a technical method of observing stars that led to his discovery of infrared radiation. Herschel also discovered the planet Uranus, which Flamsteed had first observed, but he thought it was a star. Herschel correctly identified it as a planet, and it was the first planet to have been discovered since antiquity. These are two good examples of why, when you're reading an old text like this, if you don't recognize a name, you should go look it up. It's never been easier to just Google a name and see who they're talking about. Because especially when they mention a name in passing, that means it's a name that was well known at the time, and maybe it's not as well known now, though sometimes it still is. Anyway, here's Emerson talking about the role of the scholar. Quote, "I have now spoken of the education of the scholar by nature, by books, and by action. It remains to say somewhat of his duties. They are such as become man-thinking. They may all be comprised in self-trust. The office of the scholar is to cheer, to raise, and to guide men by showing them facts amidst appearances. He plies the slow, unhonored, and unpaid task of observation. Flamsteed and Herschel, in their glazed observatories, may catalogue the stars with the praise of all men, and the results being splendid and useful, honor is sure. But he, in his private observatory, cataloguing obscure and nebulous stars of the human mind, which as yet no man has thought of as such, watching days and months sometimes for a few facts, correcting still his old records, must relinquish display and immediate fame. In the long period of his preparation, he must betray often an ignorance and shiftlessness in popular arts, incurring the disdain of the able who shoulder him aside. Long he must stammer in his speech, often forego the living for the dead. Worse yet, he must accept how often poverty and solitude. For the ease and pleasure of treading the old road, accepting the fashions, the education, the religion of society, he takes the cross of making his own. And of course, the self-accusation, the faint heart, the frequent uncertainty and loss of time, which are the nettles and tangling vines in the way of the self-relying and self-directed, and the state of virtual hostility in which he seems to stand to society, and especially to educated society. For all his loss and scorn, what offset? He is to find consolation in exercising the highest functions of human nature. He is one who raises himself from private considerations and breathes and lives on public and illustrious thoughts." This next passage is not as relevant. It's probably more relevant today than it was when Emerson wrote it. And he's talking about the need of the thinking person to ignore certain things which capture almost everybody's attention. And I'm sure that in his day there were events that would spread around and everybody would be talking about it, because that's a part of human nature, is ideas spread by imitation. And if other people are all worked up about something, especially if people who are deemed to be high status are all worked up about something, then the likelihood that everybody else will get worked up increases, and then it becomes sort of self-sustaining that everyone is talking about it because everyone is talking about it because everyone is talking about it. And here he points out the need in doing more serious work to ignore that. And social media has, of course, only aggravated this problem. Quote, "Some great decorum, some fetish of a government, some ephemeral trade or war or man is cried up by half mankind and cried down by the other half, as if all depended on this particular up or down. The odds are that the whole question is not worth the poorest thought which the scholar has lost in listening to the controversy. Let him not quit his belief that a pop gun is a pop gun, though the ancient and honorable of the earth affirm it to be the crack of doom. In silence, in steadiness, in severe abstraction, let him hold by himself. Add observation to observation, patient of neglect, patient of reproach, and bide his own time. Happy enough if he can satisfy himself alone, that this day he has seen something truly." End quote. In this next passage, he talks about how the scholar, and it's clear that he's thinking about his own task. Emerson wrote these types of essays that were sort of about life and about nature, and he would give public talks. And so when he's talking about wondering who his listeners are, he's imagining, I think, the people to whom he's going to be speaking and trying to think about how to write for them. And first he talks about how, in a seeming paradox, the deeper that he goes into his own mind and the more private and personal the things that he talks about, the more of a response that he gets. And he says that that's because the deeper you go, the more you're tapping into a collective experience. You're tapping into what is universal in all people. Whereas if you talk about something more superficial, that is more likely to be something that is less universal. And then after that, he talks about the need in the scholar for freedom and bravery. Quote, he then learns that in going down into the secrets of his own mind, he has descended into the secrets of all minds. He learns that he who has mastered any law in his private thoughts is master to that extent of all men whose language he speaks, and of all into whose language his own can be translated. The poet, in utter solitude, remembering his spontaneous thoughts and recording them, is found to have recorded that which men in cities vast find true for them also. The orator distrusts at first the fitness of his frank confessions, his want of knowledge of the persons he addresses, until he finds that he is the complement of his hearers, that they drink his words because he fulfills for them their own nature. The deeper he dives into his privatist, secretist presentiment, to his wonder he finds this is the most acceptable, most public, and universally true. The people delight in it. The better part of every man feels, this is my music. This is myself. In self-trust, all the virtues are comprehended. Free should the scholar be, free and brave. Free even to the definition of freedom, without any hindrance that does not arise out of his own constitution. Brave, for fear is a thing which a scholar by his very function puts behind him. Fear always springs from ignorance. It is a shame to him if his tranquility, amid dangerous times, arise from the presumption that, like children and women, his is a protected class. Or if he seek a temporary peace by the diversion of his thoughts from politics or vexed questions, hiding his head like an ostrich in the flowering bushes, peeping into microscopes and turning rhymes, as a boy whistles to keep his courage up. So is the danger a danger still. So is the fear worse. Manlike, let him turn and face it. Let him look into its eye and search its nature, inspect its origin. See the whelping of this lion, which lies no great way back. He will then find in himself a perfect comprehension of its nature and extent. He will have made his hands meet on the other side, and can henceforth defy it and pass on superior. The world is his who can see through its pretension. What deafness, what stone-blind custom, what overgrown error you behold is there only by sufferance, by your sufferance. See it to be a lie, and you have already dealt it its mortal blow. End quote. Those are the passages that I wanted to show you of what I read from Emerson. Thinking about Emerson makes me think about the different paths to knowledge and the different categories of knowledge also. We've talked on this podcast about this characterization of the history of knowledge starting from Aristotle, and Aristotle's approach having a lot to do with sitting and thinking and reasoning about things, and then getting to Galileo being more about conducting experiments and investigating the world. And obviously it's not that simple. There were plenty of Greeks who were observing the world, and Aristotle did observe the world, or he tried to in a limited way. And on the one hand, you could say that Emerson's approach is more about reasoning, about sitting and trying to think through things. And there maybe is not enough what we would today call science in it. There's not enough of an effort to try to exhaustively demonstrate what you're saying. And that may be true, but I would also say that Emerson is trying to get at a different kind of knowledge. It's a kind of knowledge that maybe math and physics will be able to give us someday. But for right now, how to best subjectively live your life and view the world and act and think and talk, these are subjects about which reflection and contemplation will, to use a modern economic phrase, give you a return on your investment. If you sit and think about these things, about how to best handle this type of person or what's the honorable way to address this situation, you will often come to answers that were not immediately obvious. And I think that reflection and contemplation are two words that Emerson would have liked a lot, and he spent a lot of time reflecting and contemplating on life generally and on his life. He didn't measure stars like Herschel and Flamsteed, and from the way that he wrote about them, I think he might have been a tiny bit envious of them, or at least he spent some time thinking about how what he was doing compared with what they had done. But today, Ralph Waldo Emerson remains a household name, and John Flamsteed and William Herschel are not household names. And obviously, somebody's fame, the degree to which they are a household name, is not a measure of their quality or contribution. But I think Emerson is in part so well known because he put out thoughts on a range of topics that really resonated with people. He was able to access that deep mind, that collective experience that we all share, and to write about it. And he affected a lot of people and continues to do so today. And I read some Emerson. I read 15 essays or so, and certain passages stood out to me for certain reasons. And if you read the same essays, then different passages will stand out to you. And if you were to pick up a volume of Emerson and look at the table of contents and pick out 3 or 5 essays that stood out to you based on their titles and read those, you would get something different out of it. And I think that partially reflects how what Emerson was trying to do was to examine life and examine himself and report what he found. And he was very successful in that task. And that's all I have to say about that for now. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go to my website, vollrathpublishing.com, VOLLRATH publishing.com. And by the way, it was hacked recently. That was a real pain. I worked with my hosting company and I've gotten it under control again. So if you went and you got some error messages saying page not found, then if you go back today, then it will work properly. So sorry about that. But please do visit my website, pick up some books. I have a very nice edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It has an original cover, 97 footnotes. It's at a good price. I offer free shipping, excellent print quality. I'm very pleased with how it came out. And this book, if you haven't read it, you absolutely should. If you have, it makes a great gift. It's a good introduction to classic literature, though there's nothing simple about it. It's a relatively easy read as old books go. I recommend it to anybody, especially to people who maybe have never read a book published before the 1990s, much less the 1890s, or the 1290s for that matter. And I also apologize to my subscribers. This video is coming out a little bit late. I usually release on Friday. I was traveling all week last week and was not able to release this at that time. Anyway, I'm going to get caught up. And beyond that, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this added something to your day, learning a little bit about Emerson and what he wrote. I know I certainly enjoyed it. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.